Hello everyone, I'm Enrique and I'm your reviewer. If you don't know anything about me, know this. I love Spider-Man. The shirt might say otherwise, but I'll get into that into a minute. But before that, let's talk about Spider-Man at least a bit. I'm not going to go into the backstory because everyone knows about the backstory of Spider-Man. Hell, Into the Spider-Verse already mocked the idea of revealing the story of Spider-Man. What I'm going to say is this. Spider-Man is one of my favorite characters as I believe to be the greatest superheroes of all time with great characters and great storylines. But above else, the greatest villains that he ever had. Venom, Green Goblin, Dr. Octopus, Rhino, Kraven, Shocker, Vulture. There are so many I can count. And most of them I wanted to see in live action movies. And unfortunately, this one that I'm about to review, I honestly want to say is probably the worst Sony and Marvel movie that I've ever seen. But mostly Sony. Trust me when I say this movie is not as good as most people want to believe. And believe me when I say, there are only few people, including my dad, believe it or not. He actually likes this movie. But let's just talk about Jared Leto's Morbius. Now, if you don't know anything about Morbius other than the animated series, allow me to do a recap. Morbius, also known as Michael Morbius, was a scientist who was also desperate to find a cure, just like Dr. Connors. Unlike Dr. Connors, in which he turns into a real-life monster combining his DNA with an animal, the character also turned into a vampire, in which he sucked the blood of people, and important and ridiculous of them all, he could fly. Yes, in cartoons from the 1994, they will hover like Superman. So yeah, vampires in the 90s are kind of weird, and that's saying a lot. But the important thing about Morbius is that he was an interesting character and not only just a villain but also an anti-hero. He has also fought Blade side by side. In most cases, people consider him as a tragic tale as well as being a great villain, and mostly an anti-hero, just like Venom. So it's no surprise to me when Sony pitched the idea to make another movie based on another Spider-Man villain, they decided to go with Morbius. And with the success of the Venom movies, well, kinda, but people like Venom and Tom Hardy, so people were saying maybe Morbius will be the same thing. Unfortunately, it's not going to work as well as you might think. And I'll explain that by explaining the plot. Renowned scientist Michael Morbius wants to find a cure for his disease as well as find a cure for his best friend Michael Loxian. Now, in his quest to find a cure, he encounters the bats in Costa Rica and uses their DNA to become a living vampire in this case. He could suck the blood, he could acquire strength, ability to fly. Yes, they still kept the ability to fly even though he doesn't turn into a bat. But more importantly, he's also seeing himself as a monster. However, Michael Morbius' best friend Milo doesn't see that, and he uses the cure to become a living vampire himself, so Michael has to stop him and become what he is, Morbius, the living vampire. Now, the plot of this movie is still the same as the comics. The problem is the pacing of this movie, and it's related to the plot because it moves so slow. It actually, I believe that this is probably the most boring movie I ever seen. And for Venom to be better than to this movie, it's quite an accomplishment. The thing about this movie is that everything moves in a slow pace. Nothing is ever seen being very dramatic or being very anxious or very, very traumatizing or horrific. Everything moves so slow, and it's pretty much safe to say that it's pretty much playing by the book in this case. The movie is not rated R, so the pacing and the tone of this movie doesn't feel like a horror movie. And the sad thing is, it's also feeling like it's also inconsistent. There are a lot of scenes in this movie that are very cut or very short. There are scenes that you see in the trailer that you might say, oh, they're going to be in the movie, but then they cut it out. It's The Amazing Spider-Man 2 all over again. Sony doesn't have a faith in their own pictures, so because they want to compensate, they also want to cut some scenes. And they think that by cutting scenes, it's going to look better in the final product. But they don't. They look terrible. And in fact, I believe the pacing as well as the inconsistency in some characters and effects is pretty much a contributing factor to this failure. And it's so noticeable that it's not funny. So, how can I describe Jared Leto? He's freaking boring. I'm not kidding. He's even more boring here than when he was Joker in the Suicide Squad. The first one, not the second one. A lot of people thought that Jared Leto would be a great cast for Morbius since he felt like a comic book character and looked like one. However, most people don't understand is that his character is pretty much standard by the books. He's not showing too much emotion. He's pretty much boring. He feels self-contained. And by a guy who sent anal beads to his co-workers in Suicide Squad, that's saying a lot. The character feels like very standard, not showing emotions, no regret or no remorse. I feel that a lot of characters in this movie feel by the books. The detective that Tyrese Gibson plays in this movie feels standard. The girlfriend for Michael Morbius, Martine Bradford, feels also standard. The only one that I've seen to have more fun in this film is Matt Smith as Milo Loxian. In my opinion, he's the best character in this film. You also see his withdrawals, his incredible backside and incredible insanity going through when he takes the serum, and as well as his regrets to not live his life in the fullest. He's a millionaire, but he doesn't know how to handle life as well as his disease. So when he acquires this kind of cure and becomes a living vampire, he has fun, he becomes crazy, he becomes energetic. It's kind of like his character in Doctor Who. He played the 11th incarnation of the Doctor, and he was fun, he was energetic, he was childish, and he was menacing as well. I always believe that Matt Smith was one of the greatest actors alive. And this movie, despite its flaws, is the only redeeming character here. The only redeeming quality. I honestly believe that if I had my cards right and if I was Sony's executives, I would have made him the Morbius character. I would have made him Morbius. He felt a tragedy. He was menacing. But he was also very tragic and sympathetic. So that was what I wanted to see in this movie. But the movie doesn't allow that. And most of the time, you just see Jared Leto trying to escape and trying to run and trying to overcome his flaws, but you don't see the emotions of being a monster. Part of the creation of a monster, especially in horror, is that you sympathize with his situation. The Wolfman, Frankenstein's monster, even Jason from the Friday the 13th movies. You sympathize with him. Hell, I dressed up like Jason because I thought he was kind of like an anti-hero. The movie doesn't deliver that. And unfortunately, the rest of the cast, even Jared Harris, who plays the scientist as well as father figure for both Michael and Milo, doesn't feel like a full realized character. I'm sorry, Jared Harris. It's just, you felt cut. And honestly, I don't know how would have fixed this. Hell, even they cut Batman in this. Yes, the man who played Batman and Vulture in both comic book movies, Michael Keaton, was in this film. And he was playing Adrian Toomes. He was the Vulture. And there were scenes that were in the trailer that they cut out. It's just insulting. Hell, the character only shows up at the end because they want to tie Spider-Man No Way Home to this film, and it doesn't work. And honestly, I'm sorry, Mr. Keaton, but I feel like you were botching this film. The production design is pretty standard. There's not much to talk about because the production feels the same, kind of like from Forstick, all the samey kind of things, but they were seeing kind of technological stuff. There were things that I like, but not so much in this case. And the effects are pretty much standard. How can I say this? They're pretty much CG stuff. You cannot see this movie without feeling a touch of CG all over it. Even in the makeup of Michael Morbius. Yes, Morbius, the living vampire, has CG effects all over him. And it's distracting. I don't understand why they didn't do like a practical illusion or practical effect in his face when you know it would have looked a lot better and more believable. You can add CG in all over the character when he flies or when he's trying to do some other thing, but you can also do practical effects. You can do more creepy stuff with pale skin and a lot of sharp teeth. I know this because I saw Buffy and Angel. And let's just talk about the production design in both movies and TV shows because the characters that I relate immensely about vampires are Angel and Blade. Blade is a living vampire as well. The only downside is that he also has the bloodlust that any other have, but he can walk on the sunlight because he's part human. Angel also is the same thing, only the thing is he has a soul and he feels remorse, and you can also see the production and the effects when he has to look to do stunts or when he has to fight or when he has to do the fang face. A lot of low budget production has better quality than Morbius, and that is shameful. It's honestly hard to believe that a production with billions of dollars can make such a cheap movie. Now the action sequences, let's face it, it's also CG as well. Even if when they fight, you don't feel the fight scenes just going all over the place. You don't feel the tension or the horror of the character becoming a monster. The action feels standard, kind of like any other Sony movie. And yes, I said Sony movie. At least in other comic book movies from Disney and DC and Warner Brothers, you feel there was value in there, production, as well as high quality. I mean, Morbius feels cheap, and the action doesn't help much. It's just CG galore in this case, and the effects are just abysmal. So the question is, how would I fix this? I normally don't do this on my shows, but I want to introduce a segment that I like to call "How Can I Fix This Part of the Movie?" or "How Can I Fix This?" In my opinion, I would have made Morbius the villain the whole time. No other villain. I would have kept him just for him. Becoming a monster, just destroy everyone, kill the people you love, and just feel remorse. A lot of good stories can be told by just keeping the monster a monster. And trust me, a lot of people will relate to that and enjoy it a lot more. And if I have to make another change, it's in the casting. Make Matt Smith Michael Morbius. He has a better understanding of the character, in my opinion, than any other actor in the set. I'm sorry, Jared Leto. I just believe that Matt Smith outshine you. And honestly, that would have been the only thing I would have changed. As well as not tying into a Spider-Man movie, because if something tells us correctly, and the track record of Sony tells us, that they don't have the best decisions when it comes to movies. Unless they have help from other studios. Now, spoilers are ahead of time, but I feel this movie doesn't earn my respect enough to be unspoiled. So let's just spoil it. Let's just spoil out of this. Let's just talk about this film in general. At the end, Milo is killed by Morbius. Morbius has become a fugitive. Martine becomes a vampire herself. Adrian Jones comes to the universe of Michael Morbius and wants to form another Sinister Six to hunt down Spider-Man, even though he spared his life in Homecoming. Yeah, it's pretty much standard, and it doesn't help by the fact that the end credit scene is also a mismatch. Oh boy, what can I say but this movie sucks. Yeah, it's not hard to say. This movie is not very good, and honestly, I wouldn't connect this to the MCU Spider-Man or any other Spider-Man in the multiverse because if something tells us is when people care about a film and instead of just cashing in into the nostalgia or the character itself, it, I honestly have no thoughts into this. I honestly think this movie is very boring. And it doesn't help the fact that it's cashing in on Spider-Man itself. Honestly, Sony should just stop and just let the MCU take this. I'm sorry, but that's the way I feel. I believe that the character is handled a lot better when the MCU is handled in it. Even though you might disagree with their decisions, I don't. Because I actually believe Tom Holland's Spider-Man in any other circumstances was the greatest Spider-Man of all time. And the movie's No Way Home reflects that. And hopefully I get to talk about it in the near future. But for now, let's just wait for Sony to get their act together even though I have no faith. For now, I've been Enrique and I'll see you next time.